Okay, so we've had some questions on some homeworks that some people have emailed me, so I'm going to go over them. This problem we went over in class, but we still had some questions on it, so I'll do it again here. This is, what section is this? I don't remember, but it's section 4.1. So this would be 4.1, number 35. And we have the function f of x equals the sine of 3x, and we're given an interval of negative pi over 4 to pi over 3. And we're supposed to find the absolute extrema of the sine of 3x on this interval. Well, again, this is where we use the extreme value theorem. Which I abbreviate as EVT. And to use the extreme value theorem on this interval, we need to remember that we need to check the endpoints. And we need to check the critical numbers. So we need to find, of course, the critical numbers. So the first thing we should do is get a derivative. So this is a straightforward derivative. Using the chain rule, we get the derivative of this as 3 cosine of 3x. And then we set this derivative equal to 0 to find my critical numbers. And then this is where I think people get a little bit of problems here, is that when is the cosine of 3x equal to 0? And I'm going to write this off to the side just like we did in class. And what you want to think about is, when is the cosine of theta equal to 0? And we talked about this in class. There's lots of values for this being 0. Negative 3 pi over 2, negative pi over 2, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, going on forever. So there's an infinite number of cases. Now, this isn't very helpful in its form because you're just having to try and list them all down. But what you can do is that you can say list one of them. So I just list the first positive one, pi over 2, and then notice the distance in between each one of these is pi. So I'll say pi over 2 plus n times pi. So that's when just the cosine of theta is equal to 0, but I have cosine of 3x. Well, cosine of 3x would just mean that I have 3x has to equal pi over 2 plus n times pi. And then we go ahead and do the computations here. And so you'd get x is equal to pi over 6, dividing both sides by 3, plus n times pi over 3. Now, we need to keep the interval that we have in mind, because we need to find all my critical numbers here. The critical numbers, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to list out some n values, and then figure out the x, and then figure out whether these are in the interval or not. So I'll do like negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, maybe 3. Okay, so we'll start with the one that we obviously know, 0. So that's just going to give me pi over 6. Well, remembering that my interval is negative pi over 4 to pi over 3, we can clearly see, yeah, pi over 6 is in the interval. Okay, then we go to n equals 1, and so this would be pi over 6 plus 1 times pi over 3, which gets us pi over 2. Now, that is not in this interval. That's bigger than pi over 3. So this would not be considered as a critical number, which means I also don't need to do 2 or 3. Then if we go now and go the other way and do negative 1, you'd have pi over 6 plus negative 1 times pi over 3, which gets you negative pi over 6, which is still in the interval. But then if we do negative 2, we'd get pi over 6 plus negative 2 pi over 3, which gets you negative pi over 2. And that one is not in the interval, so we don't have to consider those. So the critical numbers we have are negative pi over 6 and pi over 6. Then the next thing we have to do is we have to actually determine what our max and mins are. And again, remember, we look at the original function here. So I'll write here f at x is equal to the sine of 3x, is what we started with. And we just make a table of these values. So x, we got to test the endpoints. So the endpoints were negative pi over 4, pi over 3, and then we also have the critical points where we're pi over 6, negative pi over 6. So this would be then the sine of negative 3 pi over 4, which you can of course do the decimal for this, but it's negative square root of 2 over 2. Pi over 3, well, this would be the sine of 3 times pi over 3, so this would be the sine of pi, which that's equal to 0. And then sine of pi over 6, well, it's pi over 6 times 3, so that would be pi over 2. And sine of pi over 2 is 1. And then if we did this again, we'd have sine of negative pi over 2, because you'd have negative pi over 6 times 3, which this is equal to negative 1. And from this we can see here, this is my absolute max, and this is my absolute min.